Happy 250 years, United States of America. I don't even make videos for my own birthday. For a while now, I've been thinking of significant examples of presidential lost media, things like the Watergate audio and the lost Lincoln speech, and it got me thinking, wow, those are really well-known topics, very plebeian-esque. I want something unique. And seeing as this is the 250th birthday of our country, I thought, hey, I can compile my favorite ones into a video. But see, that was too easy, and my ancestors didn't denounce their Italian citizenship just for me to cop out on something like that. So I took it a step further and compiled lost media topics for every United States president. Little did I know that when I started this, it would become an endeavor that lasted an extremely long time with extremely odd topics. In fact, I'm sure I'm gonna get comments from people saying that certain things listed in this video aren't considered lost media because they weren't released publicly, or the private correspondences, or because it's a personal belonging. But to that, I say, you are so right. You are 100% right. But the unfortunate reality here is that not every person from the history of the Oval Office has released some sort of published creation. And so I had to dig deep to find things. You're probably going to disagree with some certain topics in this video, and I welcome open discussion here. Anyways, you're waiting for this video to start, so with that being said, sit back, relax, grab a snack, drink some water, be safe and responsible with fireworks, and get cozy, because today we're talking about lost media from every US president. Enjoy! Be responsible with fireworks. Way to cover your ass, man. George Washington, letters to Martha Washington. First U.S. President George Washington, while heavily documented, has some rather personal lost media to his name. Martha and George Washington met in the year 1758, introduced by a mutual acquaintance, and just a year later in 1759, the two would be married. George and Martha had a very loving relationship, as is evident in the surviving love letters between the two. During the Revolutionary War, the two would write each other very intimate letters about how they longed for each other and for the war to come to an end. Some of these letters miraculously survive, however, a good remainder of these letters were permanently destroyed. On December 14, 1799, President Washington unfortunately passed away in Mount Vernon, Virginia, surrounded by his family and doctors. Following his death, Martha Washington burned all of their letters that they had kept. This wasn't an uncommon practice at the time, and it's generally believed that this decision was made out of respect and a mutual understanding between the two partners. When Martha died in 1802, the surviving letters had been passed down through generations, and some recovered by historians, others lost to the sands of time. John Adams burned quote-unquote silly notes. John Adams was a very adamant person when telling his grandchildren to keep good records of their diaries, as quoted in the Adams Papers. The Massachusetts Historical Society kept record of President Adams' writings to his grandchildren that he had, quote, burned bushels of silly notes in fits of impatience and humiliation, which he would now give anything to recover. While the context may entertain the idea that President Adams had lost parts of his diary, it's very unlikely that's what he was referencing. Well, yes, to play devil's advocate here, there are some gaps in his first diary, but it's likely he just didn't write in it for some period of time. It's more likely that the bushels of silly notes he refers to are simply just notes, musings, or anecdotes about things he experienced in his life, not necessarily diary entries. That may explain his reference to humiliation, as maybe these were intended to be letters to someone he may have known and just backed out of talking about. But burning letters is going to be an American tradition you're going to hear quite a bit about in this video, by the way. Thomas Jefferson, early drafts of Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, first Secretary of State and third President of the United States, is the author behind the Declaration of Independence, a document stating that the 13 colonies of America were now the United 13 Colonies to stand on their own from British rule. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Truly words of wisdom. But surely we know that this isn't just a one-take endeavor. President Jefferson wrote various drafts of the Declaration of Independence, the earliest known being the composition draft found in 1947 by Julian Boyd. This ultimately opened the window to finding more drafts of the Declaration, and the most sought after being the fair copy mentioned in 1823 by Jefferson in a letter to James Madison. Jefferson wrote to Madison, "I then wrote a fair copy, reported it to the committee, and from then, unaltered, to Congress," meaning that this would have been submitted on June 28th, with the fair copy being revised by Congress for Independence Day. It's unknown what happened to the fair copy. Some speculate that it may have been destroyed for a number of reasons, but if this document somehow survived, then this could be the very most influential piece of lost media to the United States. James Madison, possessions inside the White House. James Madison, author of the Bill of Rights, had the misfortune of being president during the War of 1812, a war between the United States and Great Britain lasting from 1812 through 1815. Blows were dealt on both sides. Among one of these attacks was the burning of Washington from August 24th, 1814. The capital was badly ravaged by British forces, resulting in the White House, Capitol building, and more being burned down. Among the things lost were a 3,000-volume collection of the Library of Congress, precious artifacts from the Capitol, and many of President Madison's personal possessions like furniture, artwork, and presidential documents. With the house being burned down, we have no idea how many documents and what specifically out of those were lost, but it can be speculated that personal letters were probably the majority of them. Madison notoriously had lost many personal papers, either by burning or rodents or what have you, sometimes intentional, sometimes not, but despite all of that, President Madison had a good number of documents preserved, but we'll never truly know what all was lost during the burning of Washington. James Monroe, Elizabeth and James's correspondence. Another case of burning from the respective two lovebirds. The correspondence between the 5th U.S. President James Monroe and his wife Elizabeth hardly survives. There's an extremely small number of documents still surviving from First Lady Elizabeth, not just involving President Monroe, but a lot of folks in her life. She was one of 5 kids, so naturally she would have to communicate with her family. She kept in contact with various folks in President Monroe's life as well. However, it wasn't nearly as in-depth as it was with her immediate family. Elizabeth Monroe would unfortunately pass away in 1830 from sickness at the age of 62. She was survived by her husband and children, and President Monroe would pass less than a year later. Before he did, however, he honored her privacy by burning many of the letters between the two. Because of his actions, very little documents from his wife survive to this day. However, hope isn't immediately lost. Despite burning a lot of letters, some documents still survive, with one being found in 2019, albeit a really short note. Like, it's one sentence. It reads, "Mrs. Monroe requests Mr. Smith will be so good as sent by the bearer Tom $100 to the account of Mr. Monroe. Dated Saturday, January 21st, 1815. By the way, she has elegant handwriting." Anyways, yeah, James Monroe burned so many documents between the two, some from him, some from her, and yeah. Glad to see that one sentence was very important to him. Important enough to spare from the flame. John Quincy Adams lost photos of himself. So, fun fact, John Quincy Adams believed in the hollow earth theory and thought it could have been inhabited by subterranean people. Neat, huh? And if you don't believe me, you can look that up. That's true. President Adams was actually the first president to be photographed officially, we'll come back to that later, albeit he wasn't in office when it happened, all the way back in 1843. Philip Haas took the 3 daguerreotypes of President Adams, but only one of these survives this day. The daguerreotypes were taken in March 1843, and after Haas took the portraits, the only surviving one was given to Adams as a gift, and the fate of the remaining 2 is unknown. The gift to Adams came from Congressman Horace Everett, and it's unknown if he had possession of all 3 portraits or if he was only gifted the best one. Adams recalled that the second shot they did was the one that Haas thought was very good. So it's possible that he only gave that one to Everett and just trashed the other 2. However, given it was a relatively new thing, I doubt that he would have just thrown it out. Honestly, Haas could have held on to the rejected ones and just used them as examples for marketing. That's what I would have done. Like, look how credible I am with this new invention. I got a picture of the former president, huh? But honestly, given how long ago it was, I honestly doubt that any other portraits survived, and they're all just lost to the sand of time. The fact that we can't really pinpoint which family got it, or if it went into the hands of a private collector at some point, is where we really need to start, but it's really hard to lock in on a specific answer. Andrew Jackson, Joseph Wood portrait. Andrew Jackson had many presidential portraits made of himself. With the number of paintings of President Jackson reaching well into the hundreds, it's not hard to believe that one specific watercolor portrait that inspired others is actually lost. Joseph Wood was a New York-born artist who did a portrait of President Jackson in 1824. The portrait was painted by Wood was used as reference to inspire other similar portraits. For example, this portrait by James Longacre. Interestingly, this source work created by Wood was available long enough for the others to draw inspiration from it, so it was at least around until the late 1820s and early 1830s, but where it went is completely unknown. I find this really fascinating because there's a really deep and extensive archive of Andrew Jackson letters and paintings and whatnot that it just generally surprises me that there's so little information about this portrait other than it's lost. It seems like after it was used to make further engravings and inspirations, it was just kind of lost track of. It's possible that it was returned back to the possession of Wood after it became outdated, and it's possible that Jackson kept it around and it got passed around after his death in 1845. Without proper documentation, though, we have no idea where this original portrait ended up. Martin von Buren, the papers of Martin von Buren. Martin von Buren was one of the really early presidents that didn't feel the need to immediately destroy all their presidential documents. Like Andrew Jackson, President von Buren felt that his documents would one day play a role in history, and thus kept a good amount of them. The preservation of President von Buren's documents has become a modern project known as the Papers of Martin von Buren, in which over 14,000 documents from the 8th president have become available for public viewing. Now, seeing as von Buren only thought his presidency would be the only thing mattering in the public eye, he felt that his personal documents, letters, and so on weren't on the same pillar of importance. And yeah, I guess I can see the school of thought, I suppose. The scale of these letters ranged from just documents that people he was writing to just didn't want him to keep, to letters detailing his actual personal day-to-day life. These documents were destroyed, and the correspondences to them have also suffered the same fate. And because of this, the Papers of Martin von Buren project may never truly be complete. William Henry Harrison lost inauguration photo. So I know I said John Quincy Adams was the first photographed president, but that's only because this photo is lost. William Henry Harrison took office on March 4th, 1841. Possibly that same day, he sat down for his very first photograph, a daguerreotype photograph, one of the earliest forms of photography. President Harrison's photo was believed to have been taken anywhere between March 4th, the day of inauguration, and March 6th. Apparently, President Harrison was quite pleased with the results of his first photograph, and it became the first photograph of a sitting president. Then, 1 month into his presidency, Harrison died after catching pneumonia, the shortest term served by a US president. Nobody knows what happened to the photo after that, so there's little documentation of this photograph that it has become lost in the sands of time. Furthermore, without care and upkeep of the photograph, it has likely completely disintegrated by now, if not degraded immensely. It's a high possibility that this photograph of President Harrison will never be found. John Tyler, presidential documents destroyed in Civil War. John Tyler took a different approach than his earlier presidents, as he liked to be different, and didn't immediately burn all of his documents the second he was out of office. Looking at you, Adams. No, the other one. President Tyler had put his documents into the hands of his children, who had put a good portion of the presidential documents into storage at a bank in Richmond, Virginia. All fine and good, documents are safe, nothing to worry about. Then the Civil War happened. Not all fine and good anymore, lots to worry about. See, now the war started in 1861, and President Tyler lived to see about a year of it before dying in 1862. He was a very big fan of slavery and did everything he could to keep it a part of the government. So it really shouldn't come as a surprise that his last year of life was spent fighting on the side of the Confederacy. You don't have to be a genius to know that slavery is bad, but the thing about President Tyler is that he knew it was bad, but he saw it as a, quote, necessary sacrifice for the Southern economy, and joined to defend that stance. Anyways, back to the Civil War. Tyler died and his family was pretty much put in charge of his documents. He had a lot at home and the rest in the bank. As for documents at home, completely destroyed. The house had been ransacked by Union soldiers, leaving no traces of these documents. Yikes. Okay, so we still have the bank. Oh no, there it went in a nasty fire of April of 1865. Well, rats. Looks like it's gone. At least it wasn't intentionally destroyed by himself, I'll give him that. James K. Polk, stolen pardons. 11th U.S. President James Polk had presidential pardons that were stolen from the National Archives in 2002. Yeah, so that's kind of fun. These presidential pardons from President Polk have been missing from the National Archives collection since they were stolen by Sean Obbitz, who actually stole way more than just pardons, including hundreds of documents and even tried selling an item on eBay. Among the items stolen by Obbitz, 3 presidential pardons written by President Polk were stolen. The first was from July 21st, 1846, a pardon for Jason L. Pendleton, who is convicted of aiding and promoting slave trade. Next is Abram Johnson from July 14th, 1848, who is convicted of manslaughter of the high seas. The last pardon is for John Jones, John Polson, and John Johnson, a lot of Johns here, from October 26, 1848, who were convicted of endeavoring to make a revolt on board of the bark Wilhelmit in the port of San Diego de Cuba in the island of Cuba. Now, I'm no lawyer, but I really want to review each of these cases to see why he pardoned them, especially the manslaughter of the high seas one. That's just crazy. But yeah, these haven't been seen since they were stolen, and since Obbitz was practically selling them, they're probably in the hands of some collector now. Zachary Taylor, presidential documents destroyed in Civil War. Much like President Tyler, Zachary Taylor had a sizable number of documents destroyed during the Civil War. However, a good number of those documents were actually just misplaced and scattered across the country instead of being lit into a blaze like Tyler's. President Taylor had died in 1850, leaving his belongings to his family. That meant a lot of his documents ended up at the home of his son, Richard Taylor, the home being a sugarcane plantation in Louisiana. Now, surprise, surprise, but Richard Taylor was in the Confederate Army. Troops would occupy his plantation, and during this occupation, his belongings were plundered. While a good portion of documents have been recovered over the years, a lot of President Taylor's personal and presidential papers are still lost, and could be hidden away, held by private collectors, or completely destroyed now, leaving us only to speculate which of his documents will be found next. Millard Fillmore, lost and stolen presidential pardons. Yet another case of presidential pardons that were stolen, once again by Sean Obbitz in 2002. This time we have 5 lost pardons. President Fillmore's pardons aren't as crazy as Polk's, but still pretty interesting. First we have Louis George from June 4th, 1851, convicted of counterfeiting the silver coin of the United States. Next is Peter Armill on October 8th, 1851, convicted of an assault on the high seas. Man, if Armill had just done that while Polk was president, he could have gotten away with it. Next is Bernard Ockert from June 14th, 1852, convicted of passing counterfeit coin. I'm guessing President Fillmore was pretty lenient with counterfeiting, huh? Thomas Powell from December 2nd, 1852, convicted of endeavoring to commit a revolt on the high seas. Kind of similar to Polk's again, that's fun. And finally, John W. Comegys, I don't know how to pronounce that, from March 2nd, 1852, convicted of robbing the U.S. mail. These pardons are in the same boat as Polk's, with their whereabouts being unknown, likely being sold off. Oh, that's funny, same boat, like the high seas, that's cool. Franklin Pierce, stolen presidential pardons. More pardons! Who loves more pardons? President Pierce has 8 stolen pardons, once again from that dastardly Sean Obbitz stealing them. We're gonna go through everything that President Pierce pardoned once again, starting with Joseph Rosenthal from April 22nd, 1853, convicted of attempting to pay a fraudulent invoice to the Customs House. Next is Charles Billing from June 25th, 1853, convicted of a revolt on board of the ship Avondale. Minius Price from July 5th, 1853, who was sentenced to be imprisoned for 4 months and to pay a fine of $100, and I can't really find what the crime was specifically, but given the small punishment, I'm going to assume it wasn't manslaughter on the high seas. John Adair from August 5th, 1853, convicted of larceny on the high seas, that's new. Francis A. Myers from October 29th, 1953, convicted of maliciously beating a seaman on the high seas. Man, if Polk had been president. Patrick McMarrah from April 17th, 1854, convicted of buying soldiers' clothing, which I guess it's like an intent to commit stolen valor, or it could have just been stolen uniforms. William Fisher from November 6th, 1854, convicted of forging the currency of the United States in similitude of gold dollars. Finally, John Batts from April 7th, 1856, convicted of counterfeiting. And those are all of President Pierce's stolen pardons. Yahoo! Good luck finding them all. James Buchanan, letters to roommate. James Buchanan left behind some pretty interesting letters to a former roommate, or rather, he didn't because they were destroyed, those being his correspondence with William Rufus King. Historians seem to debate the companionship between President Buchanan and King, and whether or not it was a bit on a deeper level, and I explain why in this entry. King and Buchanan were both bachelors who spent a lot of time with each other, even living together in a communal boarding house in Washington. Many accounts of the two's relationship describe them as being very close, practically inseparable, with Julia Tyler, former First Lady of John Tyler, wrote that they were like, quote, Siamese twins. Because of this, historians believe President Buchanan to be the nation's first gay president. Between their fondness of one another, many accounts of them being inseparable, such as this letter to Sarah Polk from Aaron Venable Brown, referring to King as Buchanan's, quote, better half, and the few surviving letters of Buchanan's where he mentions his desire to be with King. It's actually a really fascinating subject. I read a really interesting article by the Smithsonian about it. Anyways, after his death, most of King's letters to Buchanan were destroyed, some at the request of Buchanan as they were marked private, and others by the war and flooding and the sands of time. Some survive today, however the private correspondences and what was unable to be published remains lost. Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln's Lost Speech. This is a very well-known piece of historical lost media. President Lincoln gave amazing speeches, he was an eloquent speaker, and knew how to appeal to everyone. On May 29th, 1856, President Lincoln gave a speech at the Bloomington Convention in Illinois that captivated the audience so well that it wasn't properly recorded. The Bloomington Convention was meant to serve as a gathering for the Republican Party in Illinois, where many Republican politicians gave their own speeches. Lincoln was one of the politicians to give a speech, speaking for an hour and a half about dangers of slavery that could very well compromise the Western states if the Republican Party did not win. An attempt to record the speech by William Herndon was made, however, he gave up after beginning to write it down. Everyone was so enthralled by Lincoln's speech that they never wrote it down. This would ultimately become one of the most sought-after pieces of presidential lost media, as even forgeries were created of it. In the 1896 publication of McClure magazine, Henry Whitney published what he claimed to be a version of the speech, however it was ultimately debunked by historians. To this day, people are still interested in finding a transcript of his speech. However, with only a margin of people taking notes at the convention combined with over 100 years between then and now, the odds of finding a copy are practically impossible. Andrew Johnson. Even more lost pardons. Yeah, more lost pardons. Andrew Johnson served as the military governor of Tennessee during the Civil War before he became Lincoln's vice president and later 17th U.S. president. Now, believe it or not, I actually struggled quite a bit to find cases of lost media from President Johnson's term, which is crazy because you would think a lot of documents from offices across America would be more affected after that whole Civil War thing, but Johnson's documents are pretty well preserved. Except for more missing pardons. Yay! Seems like I just pull these out whenever I can't find anything interesting. He has two missing pardons, one from July 8th, 1867, pardoning Joseph Hayes, who was convicted of passing a counterfeit note. The second is from November 12th, 1867, for Alonzo Hayes, who was convicted of making a false claim on the United States. These pardons were also stolen by Sean Obbitz in 2002. Ulysses S. Grant, lost and stolen pardons. Yeah, who could have seen this one coming? This is the last one, I swear. Also, this is the most pardons we had for someone, so strap in for some more crimes. President Grant has 11 stolen pardons, and we already know who the thief is, so here they are in chronological order. John Stoner and Archibald McKinley from October 19th, 1870, convicted of illicit distilling. Anna Blacklock from May 3rd, 1871, convicted of conspiring to defraud the government. Henry Willis from August 7th, 1871, convicted of importing cigars contrary to the law. Albert Neal from November 11th, 1871, not convicted but pled guilty to an indictment charging him with carrying on the business of a wholesale and retail dealer in liquor without paying the required special tax, therefore. Okay, well then that's new. Jane Irvin from October 5th, 1872, convicted of presenting a false claim for a bounty, which is nice, that's epic. William Hooper from October 11th, 1873, charged with violation of the act to authorize the appointment of shipping commissioners in default of payment, which he is now in default, which I'm a little confused by, but it's from the National Archives website, so we're just gonna roll with it. Daniel Collins from August 21st, 1875, convicted of retailing liquor without paying the required special tax. Patrick Mann from December 22nd, 1875, convicted of retailing liquor without paying the required special tax. Oh wow, two of the same crime in a row, only months apart, that's neat. Ezekiel Jones from June 2nd, 1876, convicted of defrauding the United States of the tax on distilled spirits. And finally we have Louis Dorsey from July 15th, 1876, convicted of larceny. Ending it nicely on a beautiful larceny charge. That's nice. I honestly wonder though, if someone did buy these stolen pardons, what are they using them for? Like just an ordinary guy. Do you think he has it like framed in his basement right above his 8-ball table? I bet so. Rutherford B. Hayes' first presidential voice recording. It's believed that Rutherford B. Hayes was the first president to have their voice recorded. The actual recording, however, is completely lost. President Hayes collaborated with Thomas Edison to use phonographic wax cylinders to record his voice. The recording was allegedly kept inside a tin cylinder for storage, however, it was lost sometime after that. Nobody really knows the exact date in which President Hayes recorded this. In fact, there's a bit of debate whether or not it's even true, as there's no handwritten historical evidence that it even happened. There's speculation that the recording could have made its way to the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library archives, however, that's only speculation. While I think it's very unlikely for someone to lie about this kind of thing, it still kind of falls into that category of existence unconfirmed just because there's no written historical account of this event taking place. Given how much time has passed, if this recording is even real, that its only chance of survival is with some sort of archival body, simply because time would have taken its toll on it by now. Fun stuff! James A. Garfield, .442 Webley caliber British Bulldog revolver. James Garfield entered presidential office on March 4th, 1881. However, his term ended tragically on September 19th, 1881, when he was assassinated by Charles J. Guiteau. President Garfield's term, while short, did accomplish a bit for the American people, including refinancing the national debt, re-electing a removed Supreme Court justice, and being brave enough to try to fix the post office. While this British Bulldog revolver wasn't necessarily President Garfield's, it plays a significant role in his legacy as the assassination weapon. And I know what you're thinking, oh, you can't say a gun is lost media. Well, guess what? I'm considering it because it was in a fancy Smithsonian on display to which it communicated a story in a way like art. Also, because I struggled to find an entry. The gun used in the assassination was a .442 Webley caliber British Bulldog revolver with an ivory grip that Guiteau chose specifically because he felt it would look good in a museum. He didn't try to feign innocence, he owned up to what he did. He was proud of it. The revolver was confiscated after the assassination and ended up in the Smithsonian and was seen and photographed there in the early 1900s. However, it mysteriously vanished from the collection. Nobody knows what happened to the revolver, but it is pretty ironic considering it was chosen because it would look good in a museum. Chester A. Arthur, Chester Papers. Chester Arthur served an important presidency, stepping up to the plate after the assassination of James Garfield. President Arthur's term was very well recorded, even down to very personal details about his conflicting emotions becoming president by circumstance. Upon leaving office in 1885, President Arthur took all of his government documents with him. Now, this was long before the Presidential Records Act of 1978, which mandates that all presidential documents are property of the US government. So, if you were president before 1978, congratulations, you can keep your documents. Arthur's reasoning for what he'd do with these papers isn't exactly clear, but just a day before he died, he requested 3 large garbage bins at least 4 feet high to be filled with his personal documents and burned. So a lot of his documents regarding his presidency and even his personal life were just burned in a matter of a day, and we really don't have a solid reason as to why he did this. Of course, there's always some sort of speculation regarding it, but for as far as we know, the reason could have been burned in there with it. Arthur died a day after the burning on November 18th, 1886, just a year after leaving office, and the search to recover the Chester Papers would begin. The Library of Congress has done a good amount of documents saved, however, there's no accounts of what specifically were burned in those trash bins. Grover Cleveland, McKinley and Cleveland on their way to the Capitol. International Film Company was a film company, obviously, founded by Charles H. Webster and Edmund Cunn. They made quite a few original films, however the first batch they originally did were remakes of existing films from the Edison Films Company. That's not too important for this entry, I just think it was funny that these guys were trolling Thomas Edison and he couldn't stop them because the films they copied hadn't been copyrighted yet. Of course that didn't really work out too well for them because as soon as he got copyright to the films, he sued them so badly they went out of business. That part is relevant because quite a few films from them are lost, including this film titled McKinley and Cleveland, subtext on their way to the Capitol. This film features former President Grover Cleveland with soon-to-be President William McKinley. It's mentioned in the scan of a filmography that my good friend EqualRep sent me, and the description of the film reads, similar to our 100 feet subject described elsewhere, but taken at a different point of view on Pennsylvania Avenue during the inauguration parade. Excellent view of McKinley. While the footage is of McKinley's inauguration, President Cleveland is there too, and they're on the way to the Capitol. Neat, huh? There's a bit of a hole in the consistency here with the footage, as the International Film Company apparently went out of business in 1898, according to all the sources I could find, but the inauguration is from 1901. The filmography document refers to McKinley as the current president, and air quotes of course, so it does raise a few questions about the extended life of the company. Benjamin Harrison, Unfulfilled Archive. Boy, you can really tell that this is the very last entry I wrote for this video. Benjamin Harrison, yet another Harrison boy in office, was grandson to William Henry Harrison. President Harrison leaves behind a legacy that made it really difficult for me to find a lost media topic for. In fact, it was so hard that I was able to write the entirety of the rest of this video before finally caving on what to put for this topic. In short, there's an archive of everything Harrison has written, all available through the Library of Congress. And while yes, this isn't really one of those cases of true lost media because they were never intended for release, basically not all of his personal letters are found and there are missing things from the library. What things could have, they've been specifically, I have no idea. It's just an inference, but a pretty damn good one considering the guy could have written letters to anyone. This is actually the worst entry in the whole video. I am very sorry about that. I promise the rest of these are actually good. It's just so damn difficult to find any entries for this guy, or Eisenhower. Grover Cleveland, again. Lost presidential documents also given away. Grover Cleveland didn't have an abundance of presidential documents to even lose. The guy didn't do a whole lot of writing during his time in office. A lot of the business he conducted was simply just by speaking, so he didn't keep intricate records of meetings with members of Congress or his cabinet or what have you. Now, this may be the funniest thing on this list, but a lot of documents made by Cleveland were actually just given away to fans by President Cleveland himself. He would actually just give away documents he wrote and signed to people who wanted autographs. Like, that's literally the coolest thing you could do as president. Imagine seeing Grover Cleveland and being like, I want an autograph, and he just hands you a signed copy of like some small bill he passed or something. That would be neat. There's unfortunately not a concise list of what all he gave out, but the fact that he was doing it is indicative of the fact that there's lost documents from him that aren't in the Library of Congress. William McKinley at Philadelphia. And we're once again back to International Film Company and their huge crush on William McKinley. See, I wouldn't have provided all that context a few entries ago if I didn't want you to get attached to their character. Alright, enough bullshit. Once again, another film that is described in their filmography. This one is simply President McKinley at Philadelphia, and the description for it reads, this subject shows the president and the trustees of the statue crossing from the monument to the oration stand after the unveiling ceremonies. Now, luckily, the whole age discrepancy thing isn't a problem here, as I believe this is referring to the Washington Monument in Philadelphia, not the DC one, that McKinley unveiled to the public in 1897. Now, while there is a clip of this online, the available clip does not display what is described in the filmography document. And since the whole ending of the company is a mystery, the outcome of this film is no different. Theodore Roosevelt, destroyed painting he disliked. Good old Teddy Roosevelt served as president from 1901 to 1909 and got up to tons of interesting stuff during his time in office, including becoming the first president to settle a labor dispute during the coal strike of 1902, initiating the Square Deal, and destroying this painting of himself. President Roosevelt's first presidential portrait was done by French artist Theodore Chartrand, and Roosevelt hated it. And not just Roosevelt either, the president's whole family apparently thought this portrait to be funny, describing him as a mewing cat instead of the stoic president he was. So he took the portrait and hid it. He didn't want anyone in the White House to see it. Not his family, not the public, not generations after it. So he sought out another artist to do another portrait and settled on John Sargent, to which he was satisfied with the end results. As for the previous portrait, it was hidden in a dark corner of the White House, and a few years later, President Roosevelt destroyed it, ordering it to be burned. And thus the original presidential portrait of President Theodore Roosevelt was lost. William Howard Taft, phonograph recordings of presidential campaigns. I'm gonna get flack for this one, but I swear I cannot find anything better for this guy. William Taft ran his presidential campaign with phonographic recordings, which is actually really neat. Now the recordings, the main ones at least, are all archived in the National Jukebox. However, there are vague claims online that there are other recordings, but I have nothing to back that up with because the internet is just so riddled with AI slop on every damn search engine these days. But what is lost are the physical wax cylinders that these were recorded on, as these molded or fell apart or what have you. It's kind of tricky to say it's lost media at that point because while yes, the content survives, the physical manifestation in which the content was made does not. Is it still lost art if there's a picture of the painting? It's an interesting debate, but yeah, President Taft made all these recordings and ran on them. Cool listening to them though. I kind of expected him to sound more fat than he actually does though. Woodrow Wilson, Lafayette We Come. This is a silent film that featured Woodrow Wilson himself. The title is in reference to the phrase spoken by Colonel Charles E. Stanton, which he paid respect to at the grave of Marquis de Lafayette when Americans came to the aid of France during World War I. The phrase, Lafayette, we are here, was made to honor Major General Lafayette for his help during the American Revolution, where France provided aid to us. Now, the film was completely lost. It was directed by Léonce Perret and was made as a propaganda film. There was a cast of actors involved with it, however, it featured real footage that included significant features such as General John J. Pershing, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, and President Woodrow Wilson. Now, I am unsure if President Wilson had any personal involvement with the project, but he's credited in all related listings to the film. The film premiered in November 1918, and while we know such details behind the production heads of the film, we know nothing else, other than it was meant to be a propaganda drama film about the First World War. The status of this film is unknown. Nobody really knows what happened to it after it left theaters. Warren G. Harding, Embarrassing Papers. Warren Harding has been a subject of presidential controversy regarding his rather damning career in office. First thing to come to mind, of course, is the Teapot Dome scandal, which is one of the most infamous bribery scandals in the history of the United States. Furthermore, Harding fathered an illegitimate child with Nan Britton, his mistress. As revealed in The President's Daughter, a book by Britton, Harding and Britton had relations during his tenure as president, even claiming that they had gotten intimate inside of the White House. President Harding was allegedly aware of this and had promised to support the child. However, his untimely death put a ripple on things, and when Britton took this argument to court, she ultimately lost the case. It wasn't until 2015 that Ancestry DNA would prove that Harding was in fact the father of this child. After his death in 1923, Warden's wife Florence destroyed a good portion of his personal documents that were, quote, embarrassing to his memory. It's important to note that despite popular belief that Florence destroyed all personal documents, it's simply not true, as a good portion of Harding's documents were made publicly available through archives. It's been speculated over what these embarrassing documents could have been, as Florence believed they could have misconstrued his image. Could it have been proof of his affair with Britton? Could there have been more evidence against the Harding administration and the Teapot Dome scandal? Honestly, we'll never know what was so important of his documents that needed to be destroyed. Calvin Coolidge, lost radio recordings. Calvin Coolidge immediately took up the helm as president after Harding's unfortunate passing while in office. President Coolidge had well-documented presidency as well, despite him wanting his presidential documents destroyed. Luckily though, we have some stuff a little bit more interesting than burned papers, as Calvin Coolidge was quite the radio personality. Yes, despite being known as the good old Silent Cal, President Coolidge made significant use of the radio during his time as president, with his presidential inauguration being the first publicly broadcast presidential inauguration in the United States. Coolidge made a lot of broadcasts back in the day, even broadcasting a lot of his campaign material from the 1924 election. A lot of Coolidge's recordings have been recovered and archived today, however, not all of his broadcasts have been properly archived. Herbert Hoover, original 10-reel production of Lost documentary. Master of Emergencies is a 1928 silent film made to help promote Herbert Hoover's presidential campaign. The film focused on what good Herbert Hoover had done throughout his time serving various offices, including his work as Secretary of Commerce and his help with relief efforts in Belgium after World War I as the head of commission for relief in Belgium. The film, although it is complete online, is only one realization of an originally planned documentary by Herbert Hoover. See, Hoover had a 10-reel production of his work as the head of commission for relief in Belgium, shortening that to CRB, which he had hoped to turn into a documentary film. President Hoover had been a good friendship with Louis Meyer at MGM and got a meeting with them to see if they could produce it into a film. Well, the folks at MGM weren't exactly satisfied with it, calling the photography bad and amateur, and pointed out that a lot of the film used was a copy of pre-existing film. The folks at MGM decided they wouldn't be able to use this at all. They thought maybe they could remake the documentary with their own equipment and use President Hoover's reels as reference. However, it fell through and MGM didn't touch the topic. It wasn't until Master of Emergencies was released in 1928 that the idea was revisited. Master of Emergencies used some original negatives of the first planned film, and it is proof that the original Hoover documentary existed. But any copies of the film are unlikely to survive, as the nitrate film it was made with is long gone. Franklin D. Roosevelt reading copy of the war message from World War II. Drafted December 7th, 1941 and delivered December 8th, FDR's speech of a date which will live in infamy is lost. No, not the speech itself, but rather his reading copy that he held while he gave this speech. While the National Archives holds a draft of this, a version where President Roosevelt originally planned to say, a date which will live in world history, the finalized version of this document is completely lost, not being seen since seconds after the speech at the Capitol was delivered. The story goes that Franklin handed the papers to his son, James Roosevelt, who would place it on top of a coat rack. Then it completely disappeared and nobody was able to find it. White House staff were apparently distraught that a historically significant document like that would disappear so easily. There is a typewritten copy in the National Archive, but the page turns do not line up with his speech. To this day, no one really knows what happened to the reading copy. Harry S. Truman. Swords, scabbards, and daggers. So Harry Truman had a sword and scabbard. In fact, he had a lot of swords, and a good many of them are now lost artifacts, so let's talk about that. President Truman received a lot of neat weapons during his time as president, and the artifacts of discussion today were mostly from Saudi Arabian Crown Prince Saud, and one from the Shah of Iran. There are pictures of these blades, and I just want to say they look amazing. Like, wow. And I know a lot of folks are like, hey, artifacts aren't lost media, and you know what I say? I said, come on, it's a bunch of lost swords. It doesn't get any cooler than that. And you and I both know damn well we don't want to listen to another document burning entry again, or more presidential pardons. Following the opening of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library in 1957, 4 years after President Truman's presidency ended, the swords entered the library's collection, where they stayed. That was until March 24th, 1978, when two unidentified robbers broke into the library to pull off an incredibly intricate heist. Around 6 in the morning, the two robbers broke into the library through a window near the front and locked the doors from the inside to ensure that security didn't find their way into the room. Once inside, the robbers smashed the glass holding the swords and were out of the same window and vanished, leaving behind only footprints in the snow. This remains an unsolved case to this day, and the FBI is offering $10,000 to anyone who can help lead them to the stolen artifacts. These folks had to have had some sort of prior knowledge about the museum in order to know the precise times on when to hit it, when security would be the furthest away from the artifacts, and the best entry and exit points regarding the break-in. Regardless though, these artifacts have never been found. Dwight D. Eisenhower Oval Office recordings. Big thanks to the Miller Center here for providing this information on their site, because this is the second to last entry I wrote for this video, and it was actual torture trying to find something here. So Dwight Eisenhower, serving 1953 through 1961 as the 34th President of the United States. Cool guy, so cool that he recorded many of his Oval Office meetings. President Eisenhower's meetings had the audio recorded in secret, as a dummy telephone on the president's desk had a microphone that recorded everything. Literally crazy. Well, quite a few of these audio recordings of President Eisenhower have resurfaced and have been published in the National Archives. The complete collection of audio recordings during Eisenhower's tenure as president is not available. There are transcripts as well, but they're more like detailed notes than transcripts, and apparently a few of the recordings are kind of hard to hear or unintelligible as well, so there's always a chance that maybe recordings were erased if they were literally unusable, so there's that. But yeah, that Eisenhower, funny guy. John F. Kennedy, different angles of assassination. This is a grim entry here, but I bet a lot of you were expecting this. On November 22nd, 1963, while on a visit to Dallas, Texas, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated when his motorcade moved through Dealey Plaza. The assassination was captured on film by many people who were there to see the president, the most well-known of this footage being the Zapruder film. However, many people find themselves interested in the footage of different angles of the assassination, whether it's due to historical fascination, morbid curiosity, or the desire to fuel more conspiracies. Popular cases here include the Babushka lady's photographs, as she is seen holding a camera in photos and footage of the day. She, in her own right, raises enough conspiracy theories as it is. Another popular case of this is the Nix film, a recording of President Kennedy filmed by Orville Nix that was lost after it was in the hands of the federal government. Nix claims that he had submitted his recording to the FBI Field Dallas office in 1963. The version of it he received back was allegedly different than what he had recorded. Then, in 1978, the House Select Committee of Assassinations reviewed the film. The Nix family would not receive it back into their possession until 1992, years after Orville had passed. And even then, they did not receive the original copy. The Nix family tried to sue the US government over this in 2015, however the case was dismissed just 2 years later. With so much lost media of President Kennedy's connected to his assassination, that only creates more conspiracy theories surrounding the events of what happened that day in Dallas. Lyndon B. Johnson, NBC 1964 election coverage. So election coverage in the past has turned out to be quite rare among media preservationists. I found a Reddit post from user u/laserweldo92 where they go into detail about lost broadcasts of election coverage, and found this neat little tidbit about how rare NBC coverage of the 1964 presidential campaign has become, as there are a few clips online about it. One important thing to note about this election coverage is that the nation had just faced a presidential assassination a year prior, so when Lyndon Johnson stepped into office, he had some big shoes to fill. Given everything going on in the country at the time, the biggest of all being the demand for civil rights, which was finally written into law in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Johnson did his best to honor what he felt was Kennedy's legacy and best wishes, even if there was pushback. But given everything President Johnson was up against, a grieving nation, a divided nation, his terrible foreign policy that was exasperated by the Vietnam War, he persevered, and his campaign is indicative of that. NBC coverage of this is exceedingly rare, with very little clips online. It's likely that this coverage may exist in their archives. Until then, we rely on old clips to see footage of LBJ absolutely beating Barry Goldwater in the polls. Richard Nixon, Watergate audio. This is a pretty well-known topic of presidential lost media. On August 8th, 1974, President Nixon announced to the nation that he was resigning the role of presidency. This decision came after a long and tumultuous investigation of President Nixon following the 1972 Watergate incident, in which 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee Watergate office in D.C. Upon investigation, the Department of Justice was able to connect the men to the re-election campaign of President Nixon. Although he denied involvement, he did, however, become part of an attempt to cover up the incident, pressuring the FBI to conclude their investigation. The investigation looked into his phone records, which were all recorded. It was through these tapes that evidence proving his involvement was found, aka the smoking gun tape. Despite these tapes being kept with the intent of national security, 18.5 minutes worth of audio were deleted from one of the tapes that was recorded just 3 days before the incident. This occurred when Nixon's secretary had accidentally wiped the tape while answering the phone, recording over the initial tape, although this only accounted for about 5 minutes of it, while the remainder was allegedly wiped while she listened back over it. Conspiracy theories involving this audio believe it to contain hard evidence that Nixon was involved with planning the burglary and more. However, that's only speculation, and this phone call could have been something completely mundane. We'll never know for sure, since it's pretty much agreed upon that the audio will never be found, as it was pretty much confirmed to have been destroyed, albeit accidentally. Gerald Ford, full footage of University of Michigan versus Cornell, game of 1933. President Ford was actually very well known for college football, believe it or not. He played for the University of Michigan from 1931 to 35, even receiving offers from the Detroit Lions and Green Bay Packers. Ford declined both of these offers, instead becoming assistant varsity coach for Yale University, graduating in 1941 with his LB. His time spent as a Michigan Wolverine is well known, and the school even retired his number, 48, in 1994. On April 2nd, 2020, a clip was discovered by the UM Bentley Historical Library of Gerald Ford playing a game dated October 14th, 1933, where the Wolverines played against Cornell University, winning the game 40-0. The clip was discovered as a result of a project to digitize UM's collection of old football films. The description begs the question, however, why was only a portion of the game found? Surely it didn't just record this small clip. It's assumed that the rest of the game was definitely recorded, but probably lost due to it being misplaced or having decayed over time. That would be a good initiative to start to archive these old films. The clip itself has no sound, and it's unknown if the full recording would have had sound. Broadcasting college football games for television started in 1939, however the sport was extremely popular with it being broadcasted on radio just 18 years before its television debut. Schools would tape their games for a variety of reasons, so one has to wonder where this full game footage ended up. Nevertheless, it remains lost to this day. Jimmy Carter UFO report. So Jimmy Carter saw a UFO. He allegedly saw a UFO and potentially recorded it. Sometime in 1969, Carter believed he had witnessed a UFO, or what he described as a ball of light that flashed different colors and levels of brightness in the town of Leary, Georgia. Despite not being the only person to witness this, Carter didn't report this event until 1973 while serving as the governor of Georgia. Now, it's worth noting that he never believed this to be some sort of alien or anything like that, rather a military balloon or something of the sort, as he mentioned in his memoirs A Full Life. President Carter was attending a Lions Club supper when a couple of men spotted a light in the sky. It was behaving unnaturally, switching colors, and just kind of trolling. President Carter had a tape recorder on himself at the time, as he would dictate the names of folks he met so he could remember them, so he naturally began recording his dictation as to what he just witnessed. While his report is available online, there are no traces of this audio recording. Ronald Reagan, 1986 State of the Union pre-Challenger. This is one of those existence unconfirmed topics, but I thought it was interesting, so let's discuss. The 1986 State of the Union address was set to take place on January 28th, however it was delayed due to the Challenger disaster that day. The tragedy, which took the lives of all 7 crew members, would be the topic of discussion that night from President Reagan, who asked the nation to recognize the day for mourning and remembering this national loss. The State of the Union address was later given on February 4th, and it focused on various key issues the country is facing, such as the federal budget, economic security, and the prospect of traditional family values and upholding them in American society. There has been some speculation that an early draft of the State of the Union speech directly included the crew of the Challenger launch. This comes from author Malcolm McConnell, author of the book Challenger, A Major Malfunction, who claims that a NASA employee had told McConnell that Reagan had planned to call the crew during the State of the Union address to put more emphasis on the American heroes angle of the speech, specifically speaking to Krista McAuliffe, the teacher sent to space. The book acknowledges that without proper confirmation from the White House, this is speculation. Reagan couldn't have possibly known the success of the mission if the launch was scheduled for the morning of the State of the Union, so he may not have even brought it up had the launch been successful. Furthermore, the Reagan administration denied all claims that there was pressure on their end to get the launch to coincide with the State of the Union. The NASA employee claims do not represent NASA as a whole, and this source is nothing more than hearsay. That is why we can only assume that this is speculation, and the existence of a pre-Challenger disaster State of the Union speech cannot be confirmed, only hypothesized. George H.W. Bush, Larry King Live, December 7th, 2005. So, whether or not you believe that subterranean or extraterrestrial shape-shifting reptilian people control the world government and are planning the New World Order or not is completely irrelevant to the actual media behind this case. See, I came across this topic from a subreddit of conspiracy theorists who talked about this clip of George H.W. Bush blinking a lot, claiming it was proof of him being a shape-shifting lizard person. If you don't believe me, here's that Reddit post. They mentioned that the exact episode of Larry King Live where this clip originates from is completely lost, with the only real mentions and clips of this broadcast online relating back to the whole shape-shifting reptile thing. Now, I'm just gonna go out on a limb here and say that President Bush probably isn't a shape-shifting reptile. Bold claim, I know, since you've never seen the two of them in the same place at the same time before, but I don't think this clip or broadcast is indicative of that. Also, why shape-shifting go on a Larry King Live? If I was a shapeshifter, I sure as hell wouldn't go near a talk show or even the White House for that matter. Too much publicity. Anyway, the clip cited in this post is from 2007, which means that some form of broadcast of it had to exist on the internet back then, although this may have just been a snippet from another website. The clip has H.W. Bush and Clinton talking about Hurricane Katrina, which had just happened a few months prior. The YouTube video in this post is sort of like a close-up of like looking at the president's eyes, and there's like a non-close-up version of it linked on Dailymotion. But there are no full archives of this airing of Larry King Live, so for everyone who wants to see an alleged lizard man talking to Bill Clinton, who may be another alleged lizard man, but I'm not sure I'd go that far since he isn't blinking as much, you may be out of luck here. I personally believe, though, that this is one of the more likely to be found cases of lost media in this video, however, only because I'm sure at least someone recorded this with their VCR or something. Bill Clinton, 1992 Democratic presidential debate in Buffalo. The last debate of the 1992 Democratic debates wrapped up in Buffalo, New York on March 21st and featured Eugene McCarthy, Larry Agron, Jerry Brown, and Bill Clinton. The debate was broadcast and it was a 90-minute long debate about national issues and how they would be faced by Democratic candidates. President Clinton had apparently been very vocal against candidate Jerry Brown and accused him of being a hypocrite over finance reform, as reported in this article by the LA Times. But to be fair though, Clinton and Brown were really going at each other's throats throughout the whole damn race, which is really funny to watch because you can see how red in the face President Clinton gets, especially the clip from the Democratic primary where Brown brings up Hillary. This Clinton fellow must really love his wife and is really loyal to her. There are no publicly available releases of this debate online, and I couldn't find any clips of it whatsoever, but we know it happened. Archive of this debate may have been from stations that reported on it, however, with no postings of any clips, it remains to be seen. George W. Bush, grenade assassination attempt. In 2005, George Bush met with Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili, and the two went to a public rally in Tbilisi, Georgia's capital, in Liberty Square. When President Bush and President Saakashvili, I don't know why I put his name so many times in here, I cannot pronounce it, approached the podium, a man in the audience, one Vladimir Arutyan, threw a grenade wrapped in a handkerchief at the men. It landed nowhere near them, instead a whole 61 feet away, and it never detonated. It had been wrapped in a handkerchief too tightly, not allowing the striker lever to release. Obviously, this caused some chaos, and he disappeared into the crowd while an officer simply walked over and picked the grenade up. Artutian, I probably pronounced that different than the first time, was arrested a few months later. This event was actually recorded, as clips can be seen in this video by AP News, however there's no footage of it online whatsoever. You cannot find any videos of this broadcast, just a clip from AP News. Redditor Bama_9229 pointed out that if you type Bush grenade incident into the YouTube search engine, you get an autofill response with these letters and numbers following it, but no video exists by that name. I tried doing this a few nights ago on mobile too, and then for some reason the autofill just wasn't working. It was like freezing halfway through. Isn't that scary? That's scary. Barack Obama, 1990s WBEZ radio discussions. Before Barack Obama was president, he served in office to the state of Illinois, senator from 2005 to 2008, and member of the 13th District from 1997 to 2004. Before that, though, he published a book. In 1995, President Obama published the book Dreams from My Father. He would go onto the local radio station WBEZ to discuss his book in more detail. Obama was a frequent member of WBEZ talk show where he would often talk about current events and his points of pressing issues like criminal justice. While some episodes of the WBEZ broadcast have been archived, a few of the episodes in which President Obama appears are not in the station's public archives. It's possible that someone may have a home recording of these, but it's very unlikely because who do you know that records radio discussions? Not you, right? Exactly, but yeah, there's lost radio recordings. Donald Trump 2000 campaign website. In the year 2000, Donald Trump ran for president under the Reform Party. While he withdrew himself from the running by February 2000, President Trump did bring out all the stops at running for the presidency. The campaign was relatively brief, with polls showing that his favorability above candidates like Bush and Gore only showed a 7% support among voters. Among his many methods for promoting his campaign, Trump did launch a website called DonaldJTrump2000.com to help push his campaign in the era of the internet. The website is, of course, now defunct. However, we do have a single surviving screenshot of the website showing off a younger Donald Trump with the welcome sign reading, "Donald J. Trump may be the experienced, decisive, can-do businessman America needs as president," and shows off some pins, which I'm wondering if you could probably buy through the website as well as donate. No archives were ever made of the website, and can be assumed that the site went down after President Trump removed himself from the running in February 2000. And I believe this is the only instance of a president having lost media from the internet, which is actually pretty neat. But yeah, a lost website with no archives and only one screenshot that survives that doesn't even show the complete screen. Fun! Joe Biden deleted audio recordings with Mark Zonwitzer. Joe Biden's tenure was a rather short one, the most recent single-term presidency since H.W. Bush in 1989 through 1993, and I'm not counting Trump here because he's currently president and we all know for a damn fact there's no way in hell Joe Biden's ever going to run for president again. President Biden has published quite a few works throughout his life, and has published two very well-known memoirs, Promises to Keep and Promise Me Dad. Those two memoirs were worked on with Mark Zonwitzer, the ghostwriter for these two publications. In 2024, during an investigation into President Biden, Congress subpoenaed Mark Zonwitzer on grounds that Biden had shared classified information during his time as a private citizen in 2017 with Zonwitzer. Zonwitzer told investigators that he had erased copies of his conversation with President Biden under fear of being hacked since he kept his recordings with Biden, and didn't anticipate the scenario of being subpoenaed into federal investigation. Zonwitzer provided what he could, so he's never held in contempt. However, the full audio recordings between himself and Joe Biden are completely lost. Donald Trump, again. Larry King Live, 1989. Back to Donald Trump again, back to Larry King again. This lost media case comes from a clip that has floated online for a bit where President Trump is seen on an episode of Larry King Live where he tells King that his breath stinks. This clip is apparently taken out of context, with the original context being that Trump was trying to show how he would take control during a conversation or negotiation. You know, just a power move. The timestamp in the bottom left of this recording shows it to be from 1989, however no full episode of this exists anywhere online. There are recordings of his 1987 interview, but this clearly isn't it. The episode aired on April 15th, 1989, and there are some clips online that are a few seconds long, but other than those, it's nowhere on the internet. Now, there are pretty similar cases of this, with President Trump apparently being on Oprah and saying some stuff, but I think that was actually dismissed as a hoax. But conspiracy theorists will tell you that this is all true, and that the deep state is scrubbing these off the internet so nobody can find them. Which I think is really stupid, because why would they care about a broadcast of Oprah or Larry King Live when there are already public broadcasts, and there's more private things out there that are doing way worse to hurt his public image than these. Like that guy he was friends with. But yeah, lost Larry King Live. This was a lot of fun to do. I really enjoyed digging into different presidencies. Holy moly, we got through all 47 of them, man. That's actually crazy. I can't believe I found topics for them. Except for Benjamin Harrison, I just kind of had to guess on that one. That sucks, but seriously, you're telling me not a single website refers to a specific letter or correspondence or something? Damn, that's wild. He was the president, for God's sake. Anyways, we're at the end of the video now, the whole conclusion part. I just wanted to let you all know I'm not going to re-record this, so there's going to be a bunch of errors in this outro. I just want to let you all know that this video has been in production for like 2 years now. Like the whole 250th anniversary thing lined up perfectly. It was like 4:15 a.m. when I was writing the script, and I'm pretty sure like 1 or 2 in the afternoon for whenever the future version of me is recording the audio to this, which that's just what the script says. So it's actually 3:30 right now in the afternoon. So good for me. Now I gotta read off all the promotional crap on here, so I get my fancy social media presence up. My Twitter is on screen now. I have Bluesky as well. I'm never active over there. And I'm on Instagram if you care about my personal life. I'm not on TikTok anymore, but we do have weekly shorts here, so maybe hang around for those. I'm working on another huge video soon, so maybe you'll get that as well before the year ends. That's what I'm aiming for. Wondering what else I should say before I end this video. Everyone is welcome here. I love you all. Big smooches. I wonder how confused I'm going to be when I finally record the audio and read the script back to myself. I'll admit I was a little confused by the wording. Anyways, guys, it's been a blast, and I will see you all in the next video. Peace.